Historic Preservation Series presented by the Indianapolis Propylaeum. My name is Chelsea Marberger. I'm the Executive Director of the Indianapolis Propylaeum. Joining us this evening is George Hanlin to present about the historic East Side neighborhood, Emerson Heights, but we'll learn more about that here shortly. It's my role today to just welcome everyone and be grateful for our strong committee of two in Mrs. Marjorie Kinley and Mrs. Lorraine Vavel. I'm going to turn it over to them to talk more about kind of the founding of the preservation series and what we are going to learn from George this evening. Also, as a reminder, this is recorded live and will be put on our YouTube channel for later viewing. Q&A will be recorded at the end as well. Marjorie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Lorraine and I have long been involved with the historic urban neighborhoods of Indianapolis, or HUNY. And during COVID, when everything shut down, we were asked by the Propylaeum to begin a series looking at first historic neighborhoods, and then it grew into just historic preservation series. And one of those neighborhoods we have not yet done, we've done many, many neighborhoods in Indianapolis, but one of them we have not, was Emerson Heights. George Hanlin lives there, and he works for Indiana Humanities, and I can't imagine a better person to share with us about Emerson Heights. So do you want to add anything, Lorraine, or are you fine?
I think you did a brilliant job,
Okay.
Marjorie.
George, it's yours.
All right. Well, you could find a better person. I want to manage expectations. I am not a historian. I'm certainly not an architectural historian. I love preservation, but I am not a trained preservationist. But I will say I have lived in Emerson Heights for 23 years now, almost 23 years, and I am passionate about the neighborhood. I enjoy it. I do like digging into its stories. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the stories I've uncovered. In tonight's talk, first of all, I'm going to start out by giving a sort of a geographical overview of Emerson Heights. I find when I travel around the city and I say where I live, a lot of people don't know Emerson Heights if they're not from the East Side. If they're from the East Side, they may have heard of it, but especially from other parts of the city, it's just not a well-known neighborhood. So I'm going to give a geographic overview, give you the layout, how it fits within the city, the center part of the city. I'm going to then, from there, I'm going to sort of talk about how the development of Emerson Heights fits into the development of Indianapolis itself through a historical context. After that, we're going to take a look specifically about the development of the neighborhood starting in 1910. Then I'm going to very quickly talk about some of the housing styles in Emerson Heights. And again, I'll remind you, I'm not an architectural historian, so I'll probably breeze through that section pretty quickly. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some of the people who have lived in Emerson Heights, because to me, the story of a neighborhood is the story of the people that live there and how they live their lives and the stories they have to tell. So I'll focus on some of those as an example of the people that lived in Emerson Heights. Does that sound great? I will say this, I like the fact that Zoom makes presentations accessible to people. What I don't like is the fact that I can't see any of your faces, so I can't read the room. If you don't understand something, or if you have a question, pop it in the chat, and maybe Chelsea or Marjorie or Lorraine can manage those questions, and feel free to pop in as I'm talking to inject some questions. I will say I'll probably move through this pretty quickly. I just practiced this right before now, and I run up right to an hour, so I'm going to have to shave a little time off of this. So pardon me if I speed through things, okay? But as promised, we'll take an initial look at Emerson Heights, the neighborhood, the geographic layout, and I hope you can see the screen okay. Maybe you can see there is a red boundary around this neighborhood. This is the Emerson Heights neighborhood. 10th Street to the north, Michigan Street to the south. The western border is Linwood Avenue. The eastern border is Emerson Avenue. If you look at the western part of the neighborhood, you see it has a slightly different layout than the eastern part. It's more narrow streets, a little more crowded. That is the oldest part of the neighborhood. Specifically, the northwest part of the neighborhood was platted first. It was platted probably late 1800s, early 1900s as the Charles Cross Trust Clifford Avenue addition. And who laid out that street, laid out Linwood was probably already there, but they laid out Drexel and Beaux-Arts Avenue, moving them. You see East St. Clair Street. They platted out East St. Clair Street, then Drexel and Beaux-Arts just south of there. And that was the original plat in the neighborhood. About 1910, a new development company comes, buys up the land surrounding that addition, and they plat the rest of the neighborhood. So you have 50 feet streets in Drexel and Beaux-Arts, and then you may see Wallace Avenue nearby. Look at the streets on the east side of the neighborhood, DeQuincy, Riley, Bancroft. Those are all 70 feet wide, so much wider than the 50 feet streets. They have esplanades up and down them. For some reason, between Wallace Avenue and Beaux-Arts Avenue, at some point, the developers crammed in a tiny little street called Carlisle Place. That street is only 30 feet wide. And if you look at that map, you notice that on each side of Carlisle Place, the lots are very small. They virtually have no front yards. If you go out the back door on a house on Carlisle Place, you'll be in the alley. So very narrow lots. They do have garages, but they tend to be to the side of the house. And because Carlisle Place is crammed just to the west of Wallace Avenue, the houses on the west side of Wallace Avenue are very tight lots. Now look at the cross streets. When they platted the western half, again, they platted first St. Clair Street running east and west. They did not continue that into the new plat on the east side. Instead, they added two cross streets. Down to the south is Walnut Street. Up above it was called St. Clair Street or Pratt Street. Sometime during, I think, the 60s or 70s, the city renamed St. Clair Street and made it 9th Street, which makes for a very confusing situation in Emerson Heights because houses in the 800 block, the 800 numbers, are above 9th Street, which is not typically how it's done in Indianapolis. So that creates a little confusion. But notice that 9th Street and Walnut Street run and they stop at, again, the alley at Carlisle Place. So no cross street in Emerson Heights connects through the rest of the neighborhood. So it's almost like you have two sections of the neighborhood that aren't terribly interconnected. If we zoom out, you can kind of see where Emerson Heights falls in the central city. It is about 4 miles east of downtown Indianapolis. To the north is a better known neighborhood, Little Flower. Little Flower has the Catholic Church. It has Cecina High School. So it is a little bit better known across the city. But Little Flower begins at 10th Street and runs north of Emerson Heights. Irvington is to the east across Emerson Avenue. You see Ellenberger Park there in Irvington is only a couple of blocks from Emerson Heights. But that is the Irvington neighborhood to the east. Major streets running out to Emerson Heights are Washington Street. That was very instrumental in the development of Emerson Heights. It's only about a half of a mile south of the neighborhood's southern boundary. Michigan Street, as we mentioned, is the southern boundary of Emerson Heights. It runs downtown, and then you have 10th Street to the north. Emerson Avenue is, as I said, the eastern border of Emerson Heights. It is the dividing line between Emerson Heights and Irvington. It is also the dividing line between Center Township and Warren Township. So Emerson Heights is one of the farthest east neighborhoods in Center Township. Emerson Avenue is it's the namesake of Emerson Heights. We get our name after the street. I believe the people in Irvington named Emerson Avenue in the late 1800s when they decided to name all of their streets after, many of their streets after cultural figures. So we can thank Irvington for the name Emerson Heights. That's the genesis as I understand it. Emerson Heights is important to Emerson Avenue, I should say, is important to Emerson Heights today, because if you go up north, you'll see the interstate runs up. It is the connection to I-70. So Emerson Avenue connects Emerson Heights to the interstate system, which means we can get around the city fairly quickly, which is a nice thing. We have a couple of streams that run near Emerson Heights. Pogues Run runs northwest. It runs from the northwest down through Brookside Park and then into downtown Indianapolis, where it goes underground and eventually into White River. Down here is Pleasant Run. That runs closer to Emerson Heights through Ellenberger Park, and it runs through Christian Park and then down on to Garfield Park and into the White River. So we have some waterways nearby as well. So that's the geography of Emerson Heights. Any questions about that before I proceed? All right, if there are none, we will go ahead and talk about the development of Emerson Heights as it fits into the development of Indianapolis at large. And before we get too far down the road, I will acknowledge that before there was an Emerson Heights, before there was an Indianapolis, before there was the United States of America, there were people living in what was Marion County, what would have been Emerson Heights. Rick Jones was a state archaeologist who lived for many years in Emerson Heights, and he wrote a booklet about the prehistoric peoples of Indiana. And he says that there is evidence that people lived in what became Marion County as early as 10,000 BCE. The Paleo Indians were migratory, they lived along the waterways. Then over the next 12,000 years, there were a number of other cultures that thrived in the area, including the archaic culture, the woodland culture, the Mississippian culture. Rick notes that there are artifacts from each of these cultures found within Marion County. Probably the most prevalent, he says, is the archaic culture. The woodland people included the Hopewell and Adena, and we often think of them as the mound builders. So up in Anderson, that culture. And there may have been some mounds around Marion County, I am not sure. But suffice it to say that there were prehistoric peoples in and around the area that became Emerson Heights. By the time the Europeans arrived in the late 1600s, we had living in the area those native tribes that we most associate with American history, the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and other tribes. Now, these were relatively newcomers to the area. They came primarily in the 1600s and early 1700s. As settlement on the eastern coast pushed them out, they moved into what we now call the Midwest. But they were here when the first European settlers came. Certainly, by the time that Indiana became a state, these were the tribes that were present. We don't believe that many of these tribes actually had villages in what became Marion County. There is some evidence that maybe there was a village down on the White River around the Johnson County line, and maybe on the White River up around 82nd or 86th Street, but primarily the only villages that we know for sure about were up in Hamilton County. They were Delaware County, or Delaware peoples, I should say. You can see, I don't know how well you can see this map, but it shows central Indiana in 1819 before Indianapolis was founded. You can see this says Delaware towns up there around where Connor Prairie would be. Again, this was before Indianapolis was a city, but whoever had this map at one time drew in where Indianapolis later would pop up in just a couple of years, and you can see it there. Of course, we all know that after the American Revolution, this area became American territory, and we know that the new Americans were hungry for land, and they came out here in full force, and they interacted with the native people that were here. And suffice it to say, the two ways of life did not mesh well. The natives, of course, were roamed through the area. Here in Marion County, primarily you had Miami and Delaware and Potawatomi and other people using the land as hunting grounds and fishing land, and they used the waterways. But they used the land. They didn't own it. They passed through. They shared the land, and of course, the American way of life was to settle farms and to purchase land and to own land. So, of course, we all know that there was that move to remove the native tribes that were here through force, through treaty. Sometimes there were a lot of gray area. For central Indiana, the most important thing to know is the Treaty of St. Mary's, which was forged with the Miami and other tribes in 1818. Basically, the tribes gave up their ownership to this big chunk of land in central Indiana that you see there, sort of the light blue. Once they gave up that land, this was the state of Indiana at the time, but it was just unsettled land. Once they gave up the land, that the central part of the state was open to settlement. Most of the people in Indiana lived down along the Ohio River. The state capital was in Corydon, but the state knew that the population would grow north, so they went to find another capital. And as most of us know, they sent out a commission, and in 1820 said, hey, we are going to build a new capital, manufacture a capital at the confluence of White River and Fall Creek. And so the state hired Alexander Ralston and Elias Fordham to plat the mile square. Indianapolis became the official capital then on January 1, 1825. As most of us know, Elias Fordham and Samuel Ralston platted only a mile square because they never imagined the city of Indiana, the town of Indianapolis, would get much larger than that. Of course, now we know how wrong they were, but in the first couple of decades, that didn't seem to be unrealistic. But starting in the 1830s, there were developments that expanded to the growth of Indianapolis. You had the National Road come through the state at that time. The National Road was the first federally funded highway, started in 1806 in Cumberland, Maryland. Originally was going to go to Vandalia, Illinois, but then extended further west than that. But it arrived in Indianapolis in the 1830s and began to open up Indianapolis to the east. The state passed the Mammoth Internal Improvements Act in 1836, which started canal building. And then the railroad first came to Indianapolis in 1847, and that was the real game changer. The first railroad arrived from Madison in 1847. Other lines soon came to the city. Many of us know the first Union Depot, which was a depot that shared multiple lines, was built in 1853. So by the early 1850s, there were a lot of railroads in Indianapolis that was opening up the city to travel to eastern markets. The industry started really taking off. The city started growing after that railroads came. Now, I didn't do research about Emerson Heights and the development of Emerson Heights in the early years, but suffice it to say that I would assume that after Marion County was founded in 1821 and there was a land office here, the private individuals bought the land that eventually became Emerson Heights. I do know by the 1850s who some of the owners were. I found a map online. So let's check in with some map and see the growth of the city. Here's our current day map of Emerson Heights. And if you go and overlay the 1850s map with it, this map comes from 1855, we see that John Parker owns this land. We also see from this map that the original mile square is starting to expand. You see some land being platted north of what became 10th Street. And then you see the development of what becomes Lockerbie Square over there to the east. Marjorie Kinley land is starting to appear on the map. But between John Parker's farm and the rest of what becomes downtown Indianapolis, there's not a whole lot of development, although I am curious about this Robeson and Voorhees development here. You see some land divided up here. So I have to check into that, but mostly farmland. In 1855, the population of Indianapolis in that time is only 8,000, a little over 8,000 people. Now, a decade later, a map from 1866, you see that Emerson Heights is now owned by 3 different people. The Wallace family owns the biggest chunk of the land, and that's the family that I presume that Wallace Avenue is named after. A man named Black owns this little corner up in the northwest, and keep an eye on that. That's going to become the Cross Trust edition that we're going to see later. And then a gentleman named Sherman, a German spelling, Schurman, has bought the property in the northeast part of what becomes Emerson Heights. And we see from this little dot that there is a dwelling, some sort of dwelling there. I assume it's a house and maybe a barn and outbuilding. So there is a residence in what becomes Emerson Heights by 1866. You can see the city is starting to expand. We've got a lot of the sections. If they don't, you see dots through here. There may be homes, but certainly the land is starting to be divided up. And the population of Indianapolis is now 18,000. So it has more than doubled in a decade. The city continues to grow in the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s. The Civil War does much to change the city. The war effort brings a lot of industry to town, shoe manufacturers, wagon manufacturers. You've got Van Camps suddenly packing up their pork and beans. You've got soldiers in the city that require services. You've got the arsenal on the east side of town. And that really, the Industrial Revolution has started by now, but the Civil War really kicks it into gear. And it only grows exponentially in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s as Indianapolis, establishes meat packing plants and chemical plants and wagon making ventures. And of course, we know pharmaceuticals start becoming manufactured here in 1876 with Eli Lilly and Company. So the industry really takes off in the city, as it does in other parts of the Midwest. And with that comes new people to the city, people from small Indiana towns coming for jobs, people from other states coming for jobs, immigrants coming from Europe, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe. And you have a rise in the Jewish population and the Arabic population, and you have this new mix of people coming. And of course, they need housing, and the space within the center part of the city is getting congested, so people start moving out. And that is possible through streetcars, public improvements to transportation. We have our first mule-drawn streetcar in 1864, which makes the city more accessible, but the real change comes, of course, with electricity in the 1890s. The first electric streetcar operates in 1890, and with that, you can get farther and farther afield in the city. Suddenly, Irvington, which is established in the 1870s, has quick access, a 15, 20-minute access via the streetcar. So makes that neighborhood much more accessible. It is the first suburb in Indianapolis, along with Woodruff Place, also on the east side. From what I read, those are considered the first two suburbs. But you see this growth out farther afield in the city. And really, I think that's encapsulated by this quote that I'm going to read from Booth Tarkington's The Magnificent Ambersons that really illustrates beautifully the changes going on in Indianapolis in this time. So if you'll humor me, I'll read this to you in case you can't read it on your screen. It says, "The town was heaving up in the middle incredibly. It was spreading incredibly, and as it heaved and spread, it befouled itself and darkened its sky. Its boundary was mere shapelessness on the run. A raw new house would appear on a country road. 4 or 5 others would presently be built at intervals between it and the outskirts of the town. The country road would turn into an asphalt street with a brick-faced drugstore and a frame grocery store at a corner, a frame grocery rather at a corner. Then bungalows and 6-room cottages would swiftly speckle the open green spaces, and a farm had become a suburb which would immediately shoot out other suburbs into the country on one side and on the other join itself solidly to the city. You drove between pleasant fields and woodland groves one spring day, and in the autumn, passing over the same ground, you were warned off the tracks by an interurban trolley car's donging, and beheld, beyond cement sidewalks just dry, new house owners busy moving in. Gasoline and electricity were performing the miracles Eugene had predicted." And so that really tells you the story of the development of Emerson Heights in one short paragraph, how the city had spread and this new development was coming. So let's spend some time talking about the development of Emerson Heights. If I move in the right direction here, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, let's talk here. Here's the right map that I want. Emerson Heights in the 1890s. Let's check in. The farm has now been divided up a little bit further. This private lot in the corner is gone, but the dwelling still exists. But this land is now owned by a man named William Tate. He eventually leaves it to his son Warren Tate. Those of you in the Lockerbie Square area may recognize the Tate Willis house. Marjorie, you know that house. That is Warren Tate. He owns this land in the 1890s after his father dies. This man is a guy named Schroyer. I looked him up. I think he may have been a politician from Crawfordsville, an industrialist. What that says to me, by the 1890s, these aren't your just average farmer living on the land, growing crops on it. These, by this point, Emerson Heights is an investment for rich people, right? It's a commodity. You see in the 1890s, these lands that have already been platted, they are starting to be, or divided up, they're starting to be platted with streets. So we're getting development there, houses coming in. The population has jumped to 105,000 people. Remember in 1860, I think it was 18,000 some, 108,000 just 30 years later in 1890. By 1904, the streets are encroaching on Emerson Heights. You see the development, the platting of that cross trust addition here with Drexel and Bogart now on the map, although they are called Bevel and Cleveland. They're already at other points in the city, and I don't know if they're there this time. There are at some point another Bevel in Cleveland. So later they join up with Beaux-Arts and Drexel down here, and they're renamed. But you see Emerson Heights, the first platting of it. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about the development of Emerson Heights proper through the Emerson Heights Realty Company, which is also, you see as the Fidelity Trust Company a lot. You'll see ads more often than not, the Fidelity Trust Company as the developer. Sometimes you see Emerson Heights Realty Company. They seem to be the same owners. I don't know if Emerson Heights Realty Company is a subsidiary, if it's just a marketing ploy, but when we talk about Emerson Heights Realty Company and the Fidelity Trust Company, I think they're one and the same. But in this next section, I'm going to talk about how the Fidelity Trust Company / Emerson Heights Realty Company goes about developing the neighborhood. And I will acknowledge Connie Ziegler in this section. She nominated Emerson Heights for the National Register of Historic Places, which Emerson Heights was successfully added to in 2010. I relied on a lot of Connie's research. She did a meticulous job of telling the story. And then I used other primary sources like ads, and you'll see coming up a marketing booklet to tell the story. But I'll talk specifically about how the Fidelity Trust Company went about developing Emerson Heights. June 13th, 1910, the Indianapolis Star publishes an article that announces the old Warren Tate farm has been sold to, in this case, the Emerson Heights Realty Company. About 109 acres, sold at about $1,000 each. So the farm has been sold by June of 1910. Within 6 short weeks, the now Fidelity Trust Company has announced the lots are for sale. They're for sale for $450 and up. I did look an inflation calculator. A lot for $450 today would go for about $15,000. The big selling point in these early ads is the proximity to downtown. As you can see here in that headline, why go outside the city? The developers are promoting Emerson Heights as being of Indianapolis, but yet suburban, plenty of space, build new homes, be in clean, fresh air, but also be close to the city. They promote the fact that the downtown area is only 15 minutes near the Washington Street streetcar stop. And remember how I said early on, Washington Street played an important role in development of Emerson Heights. The main access to Emerson Heights in 1910, when it first starts being developed, is that Washington Street streetcar line. The ad also acknowledges proximity to School 58, which is at Linwood and New York Street, and they call the New City Park, which is Ellenberger Park, which, if you remember, I told you is only just 2 blocks away from the eastern boundary of Emerson Heights. By August of 1910, only 2 months after they announced that the farm has been sold, the Fidelity Trust Company runs this ad that shows this house, and they say it is a house being built in Emerson Heights. Now, I think this is false advertising. I don't imagine that a house could be built that quickly. And a few slides from now, you're going to see a brochure from 1915 that shows early houses in Emerson Heights. This one does not show up. I think this is just a typical house. And you can see here they have a scene of a boulevarded street. This says what a typical street in Emerson Heights will look like. But they are starting to give people the idea of what their new neighborhood is going to look like. They're emphasizing amenities such as macadam streets, cement walks, and boulevards. Again, the picture of the boulevarded street. And they mention, of course, all the utilities that you're going to get. Electric lights, gas, water, and sewers. I didn't mention on the previous slide, but the lot is going to cost you at least $450. Later, you'll see maybe up to $800. But throughout all of the advertising in the early years, they make known that the lot is only going to cost you a down payment of $10 with $6 a month there on out till you pay it off. Connie Ziegler did some studying when she was looking at the National Register nomination. What were other neighborhoods at this time costing? It seems like that Emerson Heights is middle of the road. It's not the cheapest, it's not the most expensive. She looked at a neighborhood up on the north side around the State Fairgrounds. You could get a lot for $5 down and $1 a week. Another north side neighborhood on Central Avenue was, I forget, maybe $15 down and $10 a week. So Emerson Heights kind of fell in the middle And you'll see this advertised later. Affordable neighborhood, but quality. So just wanted to make a note of what it costs to buy a lot in Emerson Heights. In 1913, there's another ad that I see, and I didn't put it here, but at that time, the Fidelity Trust Company is saying that there are 44 homes built in Emerson Heights, and they have plenty of lots left. Now, to me, in 3 years, 44 homes does not seem a lot. You've got all this development going on, and I was a little surprised that these houses aren't being built that quickly. But for whatever reason, it does take Emerson Heights a while to develop. One thing I'll point out is that one of the key selling points as well was this access. We talked about this earlier, the streetcar line, the Washington Street streetcar line. It was very important to the developers of Emerson Heights to enhance and improve the streetcar access. So in 1911, you see an article in the Star saying that the developers and area neighbors have been petitioning the company that operates the streetcars to build a Michigan Street line that runs right along the south edge of the neighborhood, and they are successful in that. So streetcars continue, lines keep being added and improving the accessibility. Access is also available through the interurban. Many of us are familiar with the interurban system, the electric train system that was Indianapolis was the hub, and they sent lines throughout the state up to Fort Wayne and out to Terre Haute. There was a line that went out to Greenfield in Richmond, and that eastern line out to Greenfield and Richmond passed through Irvington, passed along Washington Street, and presumably you could have taken the interurban out to Emerson Heights as well. And finally, I'll point out cars played an important role in the access of Emerson Heights. In the early year of 1910, the early teens, the developers are promoting the streetcar, but we know by the early 19-teens into the late 1910s, more and more Americans have cars, right? Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908. It was relatively expensive in the early years, but as the assembly line process improved, cars became cheaper. More and more middle-class Americans had access to it, and we know that the people of Emerson Heights had to have bought cars. Now, Connie, in her nomination for the National Register, nomination mentions the base map of 1927, how there were no garages present, but I've looked at that map. There had to have been garages. I just don't think the base map showed the garages, but there were definitely garages in Indianapolis at the time, and we see historic photos that families had cars. So the car was quickly coming on the scene, and while Emerson Heights is billed as a streetcar neighborhood, really the car helped to transform it as well. By 1915, the sale of the lots is continuing. Again, it seems to be going a little bit slow. So the Fidelity Trust Company produces this wonderful brochure, and it's great for us. Paul Diebold found this somewhere. I think the Irvington Historical Society has it now. But this is an in-depth booklet talking about the development of the neighborhood. Some of the selling points, shows a lot of pictures. So, for example, we see what DeQuincy Street looked like in 1915 looking north from Michigan. You see, this is one of the boulevarded streets. The boulevard is wider at this time. In the 1970s, the city comes through and narrows the boulevard. So this is a wider boulevard than what we have today. But you can see it's treeless. The developers don't plant trees on the lots. They instead plant Norway maples, which I understand is an invasive species, and they probably shouldn't have done that. But they plant Norway maples along the yards. They leave the esplanades free of trees. But later they installed beautiful streetlights, and we'll peek at some of those later. The trees were added in the 1970s, but you can see the boulevarded streets. Here's a view of Drexel Avenue. You see here this historic column. There were a number of columns at entrances to the neighborhood. 9 of those survive today. This is a view of Emerson Avenue looking north from Michigan Street, and you can see the streetcar line has come through. This site, some of you may have been at McShane's at some point in your life. Back in the 60s and 70s, this became a commercial development, and McShane's was there later. Originally, McShane's was across the street in a commercial building, and then I forget, sometime in the 60s or 70s, I think they moved over here to this lot. And look at the Emerson Heights sign. There you can see $10 down still in 1915. You see in ads and in this brochure an aerial view of Emerson Heights showing the development. Look how they do not show this portion up in the northwest. They do not show the Cross Trust Edition that was platted first. I mean, it is the neighborhood, it's within the boundaries of the neighborhoods as they define it, but they don't show this as part of their development. But they show the boulevarded streets here. They show the cross streets. Here's the Michigan Street down here. Notice that they have not, in this aerial view, this rendering, they have not added little Carlisle Place. So maybe that comes later in their vision. Notice they talk about the new city park, and in a lot of their promotions, they promote the new Pleasant Run Boulevard. You see that a lot as an amenity. So that must have been important to them, the fact that this new parkway, Kessler's Pleasant Run, was running nearby Emerson Heights. Other amenities that they list, other selling points in the brochure, again, the accessibility to downtown. They talk about the affordability, the $10 down for a lot, $6 a month until it's paid off. But they also promote that this is still a high quality neighborhood worth the investment. They mention that no homes can be built for less than $1,200. And in fact, no home so far in Emerson Heights has been built for less than $2,000. I looked at what a $2,000 home would cost today, and the inflation calculator, that equates to $64,000. So a pretty affordable home by today's standards, $2,000. They talk about the clean air of Emerson Heights. Emerson Heights gets its name for a reason. If you drive out New York Street, especially if you ride a bike out of New York Street out to your home in Emerson Heights, you will notice there is a gradual incline up to Emerson Heights. And in this brochure, they promote the fact that it's 120 feet above the courthouse square, clean air far away from the grime and the smog and of the industrialized downtown district. They mention utilities, including the fact that there are fire plugs, hydrants every 500 feet. They, for the first time, talk about some of the design of the neighborhood. They mention that many of the houses are built on terraces, that there's a common setback of 20 feet, that there are graded streets. And then they get into the restrictions. No buildings can be used for manufacturing, for dangerous trade, or for the sale of liquor. And then you have a really troublesome statement. No home in Emerson Heights can be sold to people of color. This is something that they write into the deed. So if you buy a house in Emerson Heights and want to sell it, you cannot sell your house or lease it to people of color. And this is the way it is for the next 30 years until, of course, the courts say this is illegal. And so that is sort of a dark spot in Emerson Heights history, this fact here. It was not uncommon, I should say, in the early 20th century in the development of neighborhoods in Indianapolis and elsewhere in the country, but it is, of course, a shameful statement. The brochure has pictures of dwellings at the time, which is great. We see what some of these early houses look like. Chelsea, your house may very well be in here. I'm going to look at it and see. It's also interesting. It says who owns the house and what their professions are. I will point out that the people who moved into Emerson Heights were middle-class people. They did not tend to be upper middle-class people. You don't see a lot of doctors and lawyers. I'm sure there were some, but instead they tended to be more working class middle class people. People who worked at railroads, you'll see, lumber companies, insurance companies, clerks in department stores. This person who owns this house, which still stands, has been altered quite a bit. He worked at the Denver baseball team. So I'll have to check out what that was all about. But it's a great way to see what the early houses looked like. And just some examples of the style of architecture you will see, and we'll talk about this in a bit. Craftsman bungalows, American Foursquares were popular, Dutch colonials. And that leads me into this next section. This is probably where Jim would be I know he would be much better at this than I. I'm just going to highlight some of these housing styles in Emerson Heights. There are a number of key popular styles. One of this most popular style, you see this a lot, is what I would call the Craftsman bungalow. The 1 to 2 story bungalow is prevalent. Connie Ziegler, in her National Trust nomination, calls out a number of these, and I tried to find modern day pictures on Google Maps and include them here. And here are some of the bungalows that she highlights, so you can get an example of what they look like today. The problem with Emerson Heights in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of people covered up a lot of the arts and crafts features with aluminum siding and soffits and things like that. But some of these you can still see the nice bracket work. You can see it especially on this house that I love at 770 Wallace Avenue. It still has the original brackets. The soffits have not been closed in. You can see the original shingle. So this is a really good example, these collection of 6 homes, of the craftsman style in Emerson Heights. And again, this is a predominant style, especially in those homes that were built in the 19 teens. Now, as I mentioned, Emerson Heights took a lot of time to develop. There are still lots being developed into the 1920s. In 1927, Connie looked at that base map and determined, I think there were 110 lots in Emerson Heights still undeveloped in 1927. She said most of those tended to be, for some reason, on corner lots. Those lots continued to be built upon into the 1930s, even though it was the Depression. And by the late 1930s, most of Emerson Heights is finally completed. But in the early part, you get the craftsman bungalows. You also get the American Foursquares. Connie counted 70 American Foursquares in Emerson Heights. And these are some examples. You see here over on the right, you get an example of a duplex. We have a lot of duplexes in Emerson Heights. In the early years, the Emerson Heights Realty Company, the Fidelity Trust Company, did not promote duplexes, but we know they were being built. I swear I can't find it, but I know at some point in one of their ads, probably later in the late teens or 20s, they did start promoting the fact that you could build a duplex in Emerson Heights. Why pay for your mortgage when you can have a neighbor live next door to pay your mortgage for you, that sort of thing. And we do have, as I say, a lot of duplexes. Not only the American Foursquares, there are duplexes and bungalows, and we're going to see an example coming up. Dutch Colonial, you see a lot. In the 19 teens, these homes built circa 1915 are on my street to Quincy Street, and they're in that 1915 marketing brochure. And then as the neighborhood filled in the 20s and the 30s, you get other styles. Connie calls this house at 801 North Bancroft Colonial Revival. Jim, I don't know if you agree with that classification. Over here at 632 North DeQuincy Street, Connie calls that a Tudor influence cottage. And then I added this example. To me, that looks like very much a traditional Cape Cod influenced home. In this case, it is a duplex with brick. Most of the homes in Emerson Heights were not architect designed. They were just built from models that you would see published. But Connie does point out 3 homes were built by architects. In the sake of time, I won't go into too much of these, but I will point out this one on my left is my absolute favorite home in Emerson Heights. It's at 734 North Riley Avenue, designed by the architectural firm Dopers and Myers. I just love the brackets, the beams. I'll also point out this house on the right. That was built by Charles Bacon on 738 North DeQuincy Street, just a few homes up from where I live. We do know that he built that to test out some of his principles of architectural design. We do have some manufactured homes in Emerson Heights. Here are a few examples. The Saratoga model from Sears, built on Bancroft Street. Connie dates it to about 1913. This house in the middle, she says, is probably an Aladdin style mail order kit home. It's a duplex, as you can see. And then this one from the 1930s, very 1930s style, is apparently a Dover model from Sears. So those give you an example of some of the styles that we see in Emerson Heights. We do have a couple of public buildings. I'll point out the Wallace Street Presbyterian Church was built at the corner of Wallace Avenue and 10th Street in 1925. Now, it is, notice it's the Wallace Street Presbyterian Church. Now it is called Wallace Avenue. I don't know, at some point, maybe street changed to Avenue in the city maps, but you'll see that additions were built in 1940 and 1948. This church still stands. It is now the Wallace Street Evangelical Church. And then here's beautiful Calvin Kendall School 62. I don't know for sure when this was built. The fact that the ads in the early 1910, 11 did not mention a public school 62, only school 58 at Linwood in New York. The fact that 62 is mentioned makes me think that the school was not built by that time, but probably came in sometime in the teens. This center picture shows the school in 1923, shortly before it was torn down to make way for the school on the left. This school was built between 1924 and 27. McGuire and Shook were the architects. It actually stood until about 2003 or 4. It closed in 1983. It sat vacant for 2 decades. There was talk about converting it to apartments. Never happened. And unfortunately, in, like I say, about 2003, 2004, the Mormon church bought it and tore it down for a new church building. And it's a great loss to the neighborhood. You can see in the upper right picture just how beautiful those windows were. Here, this picture shows the 7th and 8th grade classes of 1952. I'll talk quickly about some of the Emerson Heights people. I know we're running out of time, but I do want to share some of the families that live there. This is the Shrum family. This little boy in the plaid shirt or the plaid jacket is Jim Shrum. I think Jim is still alive. He was still living there when I moved in the neighborhood, was very engaged in the neighborhood. He may have moved out now. But the family lived in this home, I think, from the 1940s, probably at least until the 2010s, so 60, 70 years. This is Jim's brother, Ralph. This may be their sister. I'm not sure. All three lived in the house as adults. They never married. Notice this little house behind them. We're going to see this house pop up here in a second. Joan Hostetler has some pictures of Emerson Heights on Indiana album. I snagged these from that website. This is the Jenkins family in 1915 on Riley Avenue. You can see that a lot of the neighborhood has not been developed yet. Still a lot of empty lots. This is the family in around 1930. I love the glasses on the women. They're 1920s bobs. This is a great story. This is Elizabeth and Harry Strebeck, or Strybeck. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I'll say Strybeck. They moved into Emerson Heights in 1916. They'd been living closer to downtown, I think in Cottage Home neighborhood. And in 1916, they bought a new house on Beaux-Arts Avenue. He was a plasterer. He helped do the plaster work at French Lick Springs Hotel down in southern Indiana. This is their daughter, Margaret. She was a school teacher. She never married. She lived with them from 1916, lived in the house until she died in 1976. After she died, whoever bought the house must have bought all of her personal belongings. There was no descendants. They moved them into the attic. Apparently, over the years, renters picked through the belongings, took them. In 1993, this man went and found some historic photos of this Strybeck family and took them to Bill Gold. Some of you may know Bill Gold in Irvington. Bill runs this website called vintageirvington.com. And he took them and posted them, told the story of the Strybeck family. I've taken a lot of these stories from Bill's website. If you haven't checked it out, do so. He does a great job of telling the histories of the families of the Irvington area. These ladies are acquaintances, friends that visited, unknown, but shows the beautiful garden in the back. The people on the left, Eleanor and Raymond Johnson, lived in this house on Bancroft Street. In the 1950s, 1960s, he worked at Allison's on the west side. This cast iron urn still stands, believe it or not. That is still on the house. It's probably too heavy to move, I imagine. This is Martha Scott. She lived at 626 North DeQuincy Street. We're going to see that picture coming up in a moment. Her father ran a clothing store downtown. She later married a man named Baum. She was very civically engaged, was a member of the Fortnightly Club. She lived until 2014. She lived to be 103 years old. And boy, I wish I had been able to talk to her. This little boy is Vincent Kincannon. This is showing him in his confirmation suit in 1920. He was about 7 years old, soon to turn 8. You can see his rosary there. His father was a grocer who lived around the corner, or had a store around the corner on Michigan Street. I know that he lived until 1965. He died at age 53, but had a son that he named Vincent as well. This is the Dickerson family. There's that house on North Beaux-Arts Avenue, right across the street from the Shrums. They moved in the late 1940s. Leland was a veteran from World War II. He graduated from Butler. He came back, got a job at the Chevrolet dealership at Washington and Ritter. Then he got a job at Western Electric. Post-war housing was tight. They got what they could. They got this small little house on Beaux-Arts, lived there for a few years until the family got too big and they needed to move. But this shows a really cute picture in 1951 with their daughter Linda and their son Bobby here, which is a great family shot. I like this story of Diana Wilkins. She was born in 1934. Her family moved into this duplex at 727 North Linwood the year she was born. The father was a pharmacist. He worked down on Michigan Street, did not make that much money. This is all they could afford. There was only one bedroom in this duplex. Not only did the mother and father live there with Diana, but Mrs. Wilkins' mother lived there as well. So Diana and her grandmother slept in the bedroom, and the parents slept on a Murphy bed that they pulled down in the living area. And they lived like this for 13 years until 1947, when the owner of the duplex said, "I need to move my family in," and the Wilkins had to move out. They did get a big duplex over on Washington Street across from Hilton U. Brown's house. Diana went to Howe High School. She went to Butler. I'm not sure if she graduated, but in 1956, she left Indianapolis. She went to New York City and worked for an ad agency for 8 years. And she met Norman Rockwell and Grandma Moses and other famous people. This shows her in 1940 over on the left, a little compilation of Christmas photos. And there's her little cat, Snowball, in the picture as well. The Dufours, many of you may know Dufour's restaurant, East Washington Street in Irvington. They ran a restaurant for many years. This is the Dufour family. They moved into Emerson Heights in 1942. This is that architect's home at 738. It's the Bacon House that you see here on the right. That's the house. Around 1945, that picture was taken. Mr. Dufour sold kitchen appliances. He designed commercial kitchens and had a drafting board. He designed the kitchen and sold the appliances. He was also an air warden in World War II for Emerson Heights. He went around the neighborhood, made sure that people at night had their lights shut off, or at least their drapes drawn, so Emerson Heights would not be bombed. Now, you may think, how likely is that going to happen? It seems a little preposterous, but I will point out that the RCA plant was only half a mile away making war goods. Over in Irvington, you did have International Harvester making war equipment. So maybe it was possible that it would have been a target, but I think that's kind of an amusing story that he was the air raid warden for the neighborhood. They stayed until the family grew too big and they moved out. Another picture of another family. Another set of pictures, I should say, the Peters lived in Emerson Heights from 1935 to 1940. Both of their sons were born when they lived there. This shows Bancroft, the median, and you can see a glimpse of those historic streetlights that used to grace the medians. Finally, I'll point out this family. They're the Woodburys, Max and Norma. Max was a trumpeter, the principal trumpeter for the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra from, I think, 1937 to 1967. Norma, his wife, played the cello for the symphony for a while as well. She taught cello. I think he taught trumpet as well. This woman in the middle of that picture of them is Ann Duthie McCafferty. She's my friend. When I met her and I told her I lived on DeQuincy Street, she said, "Oh my goodness, I went and took cello lessons with Norma Woodbury at her big house on DeQuincy Street." This is their home. That's the same house that Martha Scott lived in back in this picture right here. So pictures of different generations living there. I went to Broadway United Methodist Church for a while. The man who went there with me taught cello at Carmel High School. When he found out I was on DeQuincy Street, he said, "Oh my goodness, I used to live on DeQuincy Street." He said, "Oh my goodness, I used to take cello lessons with Mrs. Woodbury on DeQuincy Street." He didn't live there, he took cello lessons. So if you're a musical student and you studied cello, chances are you may have been in this big house on DeQuincy Street. Again, most people in Emerson Heights not well known, but there were some somewhat famous people. The most famous name to ever live in Emerson Heights probably was Chevrolet. Arthur Chevrolet founded the Chevrolet Motor Car Company with his brother Louis. He lived on Bancroft Street in 1917 and 1918. He was in the inaugural Indianapolis 500 in 1911 and also the 1916 Indianapolis 500. If you study Indiana art, you may come across the name Carolyn Bradley. She was an artist, painted watercolors. She was a professor of art at Ohio State University. Bradley Hall on the Ohio State campus is named after Carolyn Bradley. Her sister and brother-in-law lived on DeQuincy Street, and she often came and stayed and lived for lengthy amount of times with them when she wasn't teaching college. She also traveled a lot to Central America and she spent a lot of time down there. She was actually named a cultural ambassador by the US State Department, and she taught art to schools and other groups in Central America. She does have a connection to my house. I'm way over time. I'm not going to talk about that connection. If you ever want to know, I will tell you the connection to my house, but I do have a couple of her paintings, including this painting on the left here. Then finally, another somewhat well-known person from Emerson Heights was Bill Peet. He was a Disney man. He worked for Disney for about 30 years. He started working on Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, doing some of the art for that movie. Went on to do storyboards for Dumbo, Sleeping Beauty, The Jungle Book, and then he was the lead storyboard artist for The Sword and the Stone and 101 Dalmatians. He was born in Grandview, Indiana, down on the Ohio River. His father abandoned the family when he was 3 years old, and they moved up to be with his mother, so his maternal grandmother, at 518 Riley Avenue in Emerson Heights. He spent about 10 years there. He loved living there. He loved playing in Pleasant Run. He loved roaming the undeveloped lands, probably up in Little Flower, being in the countryside. It was a good life for him. His father comes back about 10 years later when Bill is about ready to enter Arsenal Tech, and he writes his autobiography. You see the cover here, and he has a page dedicated to the day that they had to move out of Emerson Heights. He said, moving out of 518 North Riley Avenue was a painful uprooting. And what a terrible time to be entering high school and just having to move around the city and be a stranger in neighborhoods. And that picture shows him moving out of this home. This is Bill in 1993. He came back to visit his grandmother's house. This picture, by the way, is a picture of him and his brothers on the step in 1920 in front of the house. So there were some well-known people, but again, mostly working class. Now, to wrap up my presentation, I will just say, as the 20th century evolved, and we move into the 1950s and 1960s, we see changes in Emerson Heights. More and more people, as we know, continued to move farther out in the city. Cars made that possible. You see the development of shopping centers like Eastgate, opened in 1957. The people start spending time not in downtown, but farther on the edges of the city. They continued to move out through the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s into places as far east as New Palestine. And you see that they moved to cul-de-sacs with swimming pools. These little houses, these bungalows, and even the Foursquares aren't enough space for the typical family in the late 20th, early 21st century by many standards. So you see this emptying out of Emerson Heights. You remember I said that the school closed in 1983 because families were moving out of IPS. And then to add on to it, you saw disinvestment in industrial properties. The factories that provided so many jobs to the people of Emerson Heights and Little Flower and Irvington began closing in the 1990s. RCA closed in 1995. You have Western Electric closing, I think, in 1984. Eventually, International Harvester closes, I think, in the 2010s, and Ford and Chrysler and other factories close. And this really drains the communities of job opportunities. And as there are fewer jobs and as people have to take lower paying service industry jobs, the neighborhoods suffer. But the neighborhoods do respond. In 1970, NESCO is formed. This is a coalition of East Side neighborhoods that work on housing issues, work on crime, working on, developing sound public policy that will benefit urban neighborhoods. Emerson Heights is a member of NESCO. After the school closed in 1983, the Emerson Heights Community Organization is founded. It continues to be active today. We have crime watch blocks. We have regular meetings where we invite city officials. We have neighborhood cleanups and social events. And then as a highlight, of course, I'll just point out that we are now on the National Register, and that sort of elevates the neighborhood in my mind. It gives us a sense of history, a sense that this place matters. And so that has been a big boost to the neighborhood. We have committed neighbors that are continuing to do great things. We have great development coming in the form of the Blue Line, again, along Washington Street. So about a half a mile away, we will have rapid transit. Michigan Street and New York Street are being converted from two-way streets into one-way streets. No, I have that backwards, from one-way streets into two-way streets, which will make them much more amenable to pedestrian traffic, slow down the traffic, hopefully bring back some of that retail that was lost to the shopping centers like Eastgate. And we just have a very engaged neighborhood. So in closing, I will say that Emerson Heights is a wonderful historic neighborhood. It has great housing stock. It has beautifully designed streets. Over the years, we've had many wonderful families lived here that have lived here and have made it its home. And today we continue to have people that invest in the community, that care about the community, and make it a great place to live. So I apologize, I've gone on a little bit longer than an hour, but I do want to open it up for questions if you have any, and if you have to drop out, that's certainly understandable too, because I've had a lot of story to tell.
George, we do have a question from Rose. Rose, would you like to ask by unmuting yourself, or would you like me to ask for you?
Thank you for the presentation, George. Who developed that area up in the northwest section?
Well, I'm not really sure about that. I need to dig into that a little bit more. That was a new discovery for me. I was not aware of that little section had been uh, platted. But I will say I do have a clue in the name. It is called the Charles Cross, Cross Trust. So whoever Charles Cross Trust was, I assume that may have been some sort of trust company like the Fidelity Trust Company that developed the rest of the neighborhood. I am assuming it was that company. So the addition is called the Charles Cross Trust Clifford Avenue edition. So that gives me some clue, and I'll have to dig in and figure out who this Charles Cross Trust Company was. But I would assume that was the developer who platted those streets. Any other questions? And if not, I will say I have here on the slide my email. So if you want to email and follow up with questions or rebuttals or advice on delivering a better presentation, we're always open to constructive criticism. But it certainly has been fun. And I'll turn it over to Chelsea and Lorraine and Marjorie.
For those of us who are not familiar with Emerson Heights, this was amazing, George. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
It was my pleasure.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. I certainly had fun researching it. I could talk a lot longer about it, but it's certainly, and I will say this, it not only did it teach me a lot about my neighborhood, it gave me renewed passion about my neighborhood and being involved. I think when you know the story of your neighborhood, you're more inclined to believe in it, to get engaged in it. And that's why I think you at HUNY are doing wonderful work. That's why I appreciate this historic preservation series so much. The more light you can shed on the stories and the rich heritage of the places we live in, the better off we are as a city.
I'm excited to see if any changes start to happen in Emerson Heights. George and Jim, I know you both live there, and with New York and Michigan both becoming two-way streets again, I think it'll be really interesting. I know I often take those to and from the prop, and I'm already seeing an increase of cyclists coming from the Irvington area getting downtown. So certainly seeing those bike lanes utilized and keeping them safer, which is obviously a benefit there. My first property I purchased was on 930 North Bancroft, just down the block from you, Jim. And one of my favorite things was those boulevards that go down the street. Just kind of slows the traffic. You always see people walking dogs. They've always been really family friendly neighborhoods in that area, which I always enjoyed. And I had my original hardwoods from George and I discussed from 1915. That was one of the things I loved about that house, was I had the original hardwoods in it as well. And I'm a stone's throw away up in Community Heights, which I noticed you didn't mention in your presentation, George.
I should have said that, Chelsea. I apologize. That's all the more reason for you to do your Community Heights presentation. But I will say, back to your point, thank you for pointing out the bike lanes. That I forgot to point out that feature. I'm super excited about that. I am so eager to start riding my bike safely into downtown. I've done it before without the protected lanes, and this will make it so much better. Between the two-way conversion, between the blue line, I think that will do a lot for Emerson Heights. And I think there is a lot of potential there. I see personally, after living there 23 years, you mentioned family friendly. I see a lot more children in Emerson Heights. So I think families are moving back in. I do have some concerns. Housing prices are escalating quite a lot. I was just online today and looking at these little bungalows, some 220, 230, $240,000, which doesn't sound a lot compared to the rest of the city. But I think about when I moved in Emerson Heights in 2002, the house was $85,000. And, it has not quite tripled in 20 years' time, but it's getting close. Now, let me just say that the salary that I was making as an assistant editor at the Indiana Historical Society, that person in my job, their salary has not tripled, right? So I wonder where are these people that maybe not able to afford very expensive homes. If you can't afford it in Emerson Heights anymore, where are you going? So housing prices are a concern. Also, you see a lot of out-of-state
Investors and renters and
investors
landlords.
coming and converting into apartments, which is taking away from the housing and again driving up those prices. The other concern I have is the insensitive renovations. You see a lot of people coming in and they're removing that hard word and they're making the bungalows one big living space, and they're removing the walls and they're painting them gray, and if the woodwork remains they paint it white and they put down that cheap laminate flooring or whatever. I have concerns about that, and of course then on the exterior putting up the vinyl siding and the too small windows without the proper. So we need to do a better job in Emerson Heights of talking about the tax credits that you get from the fact that we're a National Historic District and encouraging people to renovate in sensitive ways. But it's hard when you're getting these out-of-state investors and they don't really care about the historic nature of the neighborhood. But yes, there is a lot of promise. And Jim, you might have thoughts about this too.
Yes, I mean, then I've lived in the neighborhood for 27 years, and there's been changes for the better in terms of rehabilitation. It's been a fairly stable neighborhood, I think, over the years. There's some new people in the neighborhood that are pitching in and improving it. Prices are up in terms of houses, as George says. That's sort of all over the place, I guess.
Yeah, I saw Marisol was on. I think she still is. I saw a house in Little Flower go up on the market yesterday for $320, George. It's a beautiful home, but oh man, I remember when I bought my first home about 10 years ago, and I bought it with the first time home buyers program through the National Bank of Indianapolis, which no longer exists. So hopefully these East Side communities that have accessibility to jobs and community institutions and those sorts of things that really enrich people's lives, that we can maintain some type of affordable housing.
Right. And I think the city plays an important role in that. And I hope they'll take up leadership. And that's why NEAR, and I know Marisol, it sounds like it's on here. She's on the board of NEAR, Near East Area Renewal, I believe is what it stands for. They are working to buy properties and maintain affordability. So that's important. Chelsea, you talk about the rising prices. I drive into work on Jefferson Avenue. I come down Michigan, jog up to 10th on Jefferson because there's a light there. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, you could buy those houses for probably $100,000 or less. Now many of them have been rehabilitated and they're costing you $500,000, if not more. So this is the concern that as redevelopment comes farther and farther east, in some ways you can say that's a good thing, but it definitely, it makes neighborhoods unaffordable for, again, the types of working class people that developed Emerson Heights and made it their home from the early days.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, George.